Hello everyone and welcome. This is chapter number 20. This is Chef Hawks, and so today we are talking all about cakes and pies. So let's get right into this. So let's take a look at the bases of cakes. So a cake is a sweet baked food. So it's either made with a dough or a thick batter. And so we use flour as our strengthener. We've talked about strengtheners before in ProStart 1, where we talk about that as the bulk and the structure to a lot of our baked products. And it also would include shortening or some kind of other fat, maybe butter, with eggs and a leavening agent. And so then if we look at what is a batter, so a batter is a semi-liquid mixture. So we use flour, a liquid of some sort, and then some other ingredients we may add in there. If a batter is thin enough, then it can be poured. If it's made with, and it's generally made with more fat and sugar than a dough. That's what differentiates the two. When we take a look at the different categories of cake, so we have high-fat cakes. So high-fat cakes, generally you will use the cream method. So you actually have you actually have solid fat in there. You'll use it where you're creaming that with the sugar, and it comes out with things like butter cakes and pound cakes. If we're looking at egg foam cakes, on the other hand, so generally they have either no fat at all or very little fat, and it's generally using a liquid fat. And then we'll use eggs in there as well. Quite often you would actually separate those eggs. You may just use egg whites or just egg yolks, or it could be a combination of both, but you foam them up, you whip them up to add a lot of voluminous air to them. It makes a very, very light cake. Things like angel food cake, sponge cake, and chiffon cakes. But let's talk through some methods here. So the creaming method. This is where we're creaming fat and sugar together. So we'll actually put it into our mixer, we'll put the paddle beater on there, and we will beat that cream, we'll beat the fat, if it's butter. That butter normally starts off yellow, as you all know, but then as you beat it and it adds more air into it, it turns to a much lighter, almost white color, and then you're adding the sugar into there as well to create the base before you're adding in the eggs and the flour after that. This method creates a very, very fine crumb in that cake. It gives a good dense and rich texture to the cake. And so this can be, for instance, a yellow butter cake is very popular using the creaming method. So with foaming methods, like I mentioned, and as you can see over here, this is an angel food cake. So with a foaming method, you take the whole eggs, the egg yolks or the egg whites only, and you'll beat those very, very until they get to a full peak, a firm peak, so that way they have a very, very light texture. They're very aerated. Things like angel food cake and chiffon cake are perfect examples of a foaming method cake. Then we also have two-stage method cakes. So this is where we have a much higher ratio on our cakes on our recipe. It has much more sugar than flour. Generally, in most of our baked products, flour is the number one ingredient that's the strengthener, that gives the majority of what's in that cake or in that pastry. With a two-stage method cake, this is where you're going to have more sugar. This creates a very fine crumb, but it also makes a very moist, very rich kind of a cake. And a perfect example of this is the devil's food cake, and that's exactly what you can see in the picture right over here. So let's take a look at icings. What is an icing? So that is a sweet coating that goes over the cake. It may go just on the top of the cake. It may fully envelop the entire cake. So cakes and other baked products use sweet coatings, icings. But what's the main functions for these icings? So it's a protective coating. Cakes tend to go dry and stale very, very quickly. And so this gives a protective coating. Because it has a high fat content, it contributes flavor and richness to it whilst maintaining moisture within the cake itself. And it can also improve the appearance. You can do some amazing decorative results with icing. And we'll take a look at those in just a couple of minutes. So anytime you're making icing, you always want to use top quality flavoring ingredients in there. because you want to make sure that that is going probably to be the first thing that you taste on that cake. So you want to make sure that it's going to be exactly what you want on there. It should enhance the cake. It should not take away from the cake. You can make very light and delicate icings, but they shouldn't overwhelm any of that cake. And generally speaking, if you're making some kind of a frosting, if it's on the heavier side, you put that with a heavy cake. Light frosting should always be applied to lighter cakes. So let's take a look at the first of several different examples of the types of icings that we can make. So one of the simplest right here is buttercream. So buttercream is actually a combination of sugar and fat. Very often we would use butter. You can use margarine or something like that, but butter always adds that extra richness and flavor to it. And you can create all sorts of different colors and flavors by adding colorings and flavorings to these as well. So they're excellent all-round icings to be able to use. They're rich, but they're light because they're very whipped and fluffy. And they basically what you will use is when you make one of these is you'll have to soften it up because that butter content when it's cold it will go much more rigid, much firmer. So you need to be able to have it soft before you start using it. It's perfect to use on cupcakes, genoise, and butter cakes. So let's take a quick look at exactly how to make some buttercream.
Prepare simple buttercream icing. Begin.
So let's take a quick look at how to make a simple buttercream icing.
Prepare simple buttercream icing. Begin by adding softened butter to a mixer with a paddle attachment. Add the sifted powdered sugar until the sugar is fully incorporated into the butter. Pause the mixer to scrape down the sides to make sure all the ingredients are fully incorporated. Now, add the vanilla and the heavy cream. Depending on the texture desired, you can add more or less cream for a thinner or a thicker icing. Prepare simple buttercream icing.
And so now let's join this video right here. We can actually see some great uses that we can place with the buttercream icing and exactly some ways we can manipulate it to be incredibly decorative.
Tons of Russian piping tips, and there's actually a whole separate variety called balloon tips. Those are the kind that I want to try next. But these jumbo mega piping tips will do almost anything you can imagine, from piping flowers to sets of petals to nice patterns that you can use to decorate cakes. Let's choose a few that look more interesting. This guy seems kind of fun. This one will be like a cool rose. I want to do some flowers, so we're going to make that happen. I'll start with these, and we'll see how it goes. Into the box. All right, these are the most moist and delicious vanilla cupcakes you've ever had. Click up here if you want to make a batch, but today's all about decorating. And what I'll be decorating with is my Swiss meringue buttercream. You can click up here for that. It is just the best type of buttercream for decorating because it is silky smooth, razor sharp, and pretty stable. Something to remember about any meringue-based buttercream is that it will lose consistency completely if you let it hang out for a bit. But don't let that dissuade you. All you have to do is give it a really quick 30-second whip, and it comes back to life in an instant. A little bit of buttercream for everybody. So Russian piping tips are really cool because you just pipe a whole entire flower, but the thing is that you have to have a nicely colored flower. You're in charge of the color, so you got to do a good job. And they look best when you're using multiple colors. So open my box of crayons, and choose some colors. I think we'll have a little bit of green for the leaves. Ooh, a coral, that's nice. Maybe like a sherbety orange, a soft pink, and yellow. It's like a starting point. We can also do some purple. If you don't like using food coloring, there's tons of different alternatives. So instead of green dye, you could add in a little bit of green matcha powder, and that'll give you like a really nice soft pastel color. But in the meantime, you can see just that couple seconds of whipping, and it's nice and silky now. Did I mention how huge these piping tips are? This is a Russian piping tip. This is like a regular medium tip, so you can see you're going to have to snip a much bigger hole. Don't worry about filling these up with a ton of buttercream. You don't want to do that, actually. Pop that in there. Let's take a look. Push it on through. There we go. Nice. Okay, so filling these is going to be something you want to pay attention to. Pop it into a glass. That'll be the easiest way. And now, choose like probably the darker color. Here, I'll choose a pink. And just paint the inside of the piping bag with that buttercream. So now we're going to fill it up with a lighter shade of pink so we get nice gradients. That is the neatest filling job I've ever done. Alright, so twist it shut. Just remove any air gaps you have in there. These are going to have really pretty flowers, but I'm going to pipe some leaves in there to fill in the gaps because I don't want to have blank spaces on my cupcakes. I'm using a 352 tip, which is like a larger leaf tip. Alright, now let's add a little bit of green buttercream into that piping bag with the leaf tip, and we're ready to go. To get the cupcake started, I'm adding a really thin layer of buttercream onto the surface. This is just going to help all those little flowers and leaves stick. When you're using these really soft buttercreams, which you need for Russian piping tips, things can get a little bit messy. So, start hovering just above the cupcake, squeeze the buttercream out, and once it makes contact with the cupcake, you're going to keep squeezing while you pull up until you get the desired height. Then, stop squeezing, but keep pulling, and that's it. Repeat the process over and over and over again until the cupcake is completely covered, or as covered as you want it to be. It's your cupcake, and you can do whatever you like. Okay, now it's time to add our leaves on with our leaf piping tip. You can add as many leaves or as few as you want. They don't have to be green. You could add purple leaves in. It's totally up to you. Next, we have this piping tip, which is going to make like a tulip shape. So, definitely going to have the yellow buttercream in there. So once again, we're going to coat the inside of the piping bag with a thin-ish layer, maybe like a quarter of an inch or so, of that purple buttercream. Fill it up with the yellow buttercream in the center, and then twist it up, and you're ready to squeeze it out. Once again, I coated my cupcake with a thin layer of buttercream, and it's time to pipe again. Hover just above that buttercream, squeeze, pipe, pull up, stop squeezing, keep pulling up. The second flower had an issue. I did not make full contact, so part of it did not release properly. No problem, just use a palette knife and scrape it off. Do over, and now let's continue covering that cupcake. We're going to get about 7 flowers on here. I tried to squeeze more, but it wasn't really working, so stick with around 7 flowers. This time I'm using that beautiful coral color, filling it with yellow, a little bit more vivid this time. I don't know if you can tell. Squeeze it out, and look how pretty that is. Right, repeat the process once again. This one is making, I don't know, some kind of a beautiful flower I've never seen before. It has a yellow center too, which is pretty. Add some more leaves on, and then you can just repeat the process. I am loving these piping tips. I will not lie to you though, it's taking me a second to get a grasp of exactly how to squeeze and release. Alright, now we're going to try another piping tip. This one is going to be a beautiful daisy, I think. I'm not sure. Yes, I added some yellow buttercream into the center, but it's going to take a while for it to pop out. They don't all have to look exactly the same. That yellow eventually came out on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6th flower. Add some more leaves, and these look kind of like very pretty, similar to flowers, but not really flowers. I don't know what to call them. I liked them. They're one of my favorites, even though they are the least flower-like flower tip. My batch of cupcakes is all done. I gotta say, they look pretty nice. It's like a springtime explosion on my kitchen counter.
Pretty amazing overall, just what you can actually do with a very simple arrangement of different piping nozzles. We have a lot of these piping nozzles at school as well. Lots of things to adventure with. Now we'll take a look at some other different types of icing. So this example here is foam or boiled icing. It's also known as Italian meringue as well. This is when you actually have a hot sugar syrup that you add to the whipping egg whites, and this creates a very voluminous and very airy type of an icing. You can have it maybe a lemon or a chocolate cake could be perfect to use this on. You want to actually use this on the day that you make it. You want to have it in where it's got big, thick layers of it. This is something that really adds something big to your cake itself. So it's great to be able to use with layer cakes. And when we talk about layer cakes, if you look over on the picture here, you can actually see where there are separate layers. There's a top layer, there's a layer of the actual icing, and then there's the base layer as well. This is perfect for that type of thing. These work really well if you want to add any extracts or liqueurs to give additional flavors to these kinds of icings. Now, one thing is, this icing does not freeze well. So then we have fondant. So fondant is a very smooth and creamy type of icing. It's made with sugar, water, glucose, and corn syrups. So it has a nice shine, a nice sheen to it, but it's not a sticky kind of a coating. Whereas when you look at some of the other ones, like we just looked at with the Italian, or if we're looking at buttercream, they have a sticky kind of a texture to them. This will actually have more of a matte type of a finish to it. It's definitely a convenience type of product. You can actually have it different kinds of thicknesses to create that shell and that wonderful edge and nice finish to a cake. So this is something that works well on things like eclairs or petit fours, for cakes and Napoleons where you have layers, and for things like specialty cakes and wedding cakes. This is very popular, gives a very professional edge to it. Then fudge icing, now we're looking at something that's a really, really rich type of an icing. Very often you would use cocoa or chocolate flavoring in there, but there's a lot of sugar, butter, and liquid that you actually put in there. You will apply this kind of icing while this cake while everything is still warm. It holds well once it cools down. This is perfect to be able to use on cupcakes, layer cakes, sheet cakes like you see in the picture here. Chocolate and vanilla flavored are very popular forms of fudge icing as well. So with ganache, this is something that you make a very smooth mixture that includes chocolate and cream. You boil up the cream and you add in the chocolate flakes in there. So this is perfect to be able to cover cakes and torts. And as you can see, it has this wonderful kind of a shine to it, and it completely and perfectly coats the entire cake. This is also something you can use if you cool the ganache down to make truffles, to make small little soft chocolates that you can enjoy as well. But it works really well for glazes for cakes. You can whip it up and to have it as a rich, smooth frosting. You can remelt it if you want it to go back down to being a glaze again. So speaking of glazing, so glaze icing, this is another type, and as you can see in the picture over on the right hand side, we use it a lot with things like donuts. But so it's a very simple type of mix using corn syrup. Corn syrup very often will be used in that glaze. But all you want to have there is something that will just coat over, not necessarily adding anything additional to it, but just giving this nice texture to the outside. You can, if you want, add different flavors to it, but it gives a nice shine to the outside. You would generally drizzle this over the top of things. If it's on a donut like this, you can dip it in there as well, but you want there just to be a thin layer over the top. This isn't something where we're putting copious amounts and expecting copious amounts to hold onto it as well. So this is very often used in, as we can see, the donuts that we can see in the picture there, but angel food cake, chiffon cakes as well, and then flat icing or water icing can be used on Danish and coffee cakes as well. So let's look at royal icing. So this is something we've used in our kitchen. As you can see over on the right hand side here, some great examples of ways that we've used royal icing. So this is a decorator's icing. So this isn't something you're necessarily going to use to coat a massive cake with, but it's great for adding details and for construction as well. So we use this actually when you go and take some egg whites and some confectioner's sugar, and you mix them together until you get a good thick kind of a coating kind of a consistency. You're not cooking this icing. It doesn't need that. But then, so for us, when we made these gingerbread houses, we put it into piping bags, and we literally just piped in between the crackers so that they would stick together, and literally within a matter of minutes, it will start to solidify to the extent where structurally it can hold together some pretty significant weights. As you can see on this, we have multiple different layers with all sorts of different candies and things applied to them, and they will hold very successfully. You can add food coloring to it, so as you can see on here, we made some flower kind of decorations to the top of these cookies here, so it can be used for nice detailed work as well. Just beware, it does dry to a brittle type of texture afterwards, and so because of that, you have to make sure you're using it for the purpose you want. It's not going to be something like a buttercream, which will stay in a soft kind of a texture. So like I said, we can use it for fine piping on things like wedding cakes and specialty cakes, cookies, various different things like that. But it works wonderfully for our gingerbread house making. So we've already taken a look at buttercream icing and how we prepare that. For all intents and purposes, just taking the powdered sugar and the butter, adding those together, and we have a little cream that we add in there and some vanilla extract. Just a very, very simple type of an icing. So then if we go and take a look at foam icing, so we briefly talked about that. I have a quick video that we can watch all about this. So this is the foam or boiled icing, and so this is actually the starting of another type of icing too. So let's start off with this boiled icing to start off with, and we'll move on from there. Okay, so that was a great example showing us about how to make the foam icing. And so that was the beginning part there, so where they took that boiling hot sugar and they added it to the beating egg whites. However, we can take it another step further. So that was Italian meringue. Well, now if we are to actually finish this off and make something a little bigger and better, we can actually add butter to this. So we're partway through this video here that's already taken us to this stage. This gentleman's about to add in the hot sugar, and then after that, I want to take a look and see what happens when we start adding the butter to make it something even bigger and better.
This is the part where you have to be very careful because this sugar is hot. 240 degrees is like 3rd degree burn time. All right, so mixer on low, and we're going to drizzle this in slowly and carefully. A slow, slow drizzle. The sugar is cooking the eggs and stabilizing them, so you're going to get this amazing silky meringue, which is actually great for decorating pies and cakes too, if you'd like a lighter option. Okay. Get all that sugar out of there. So now let's increase the speed just a bit. Do you feel the bowl? It is hot. These eggs are really, really, really hot. And I'm going to stop this just to show you so you can see how amazing and beautiful Italian meringue is. So, Cool Whip. Look at this. It's totally not ready yet. It's very soft, but it's so silky and shiny and delicious. A lot of people ask me if I absolutely have to use a standing mixer for this recipe. And I guess the answer is no, you could use a hand mixer. However, this meringue has to run for like 15 to 20 minutes for it to cool down because you cannot add the butter in until the meringue is room temperature. If you're short on time, which I often am, pack the bowl with ice or frozen peas or frozen vegetables, whatever, just to get it to cool down more quickly. Alright, I know I'm being kind of a dork, but I have to show this to you again now that it's a bit more set up. Look at this meringue. Do you see those razor sharp edges? It is gorgeous. Here, I'll do another dip. Look at that. It's so pretty. Okay. I'm gonna let this run. Come back to you when you're room temp. My meringue is room temperature, which means it's time to add in that whole pound of unsalted room temperature butter. Can you add less butter in? Nope. If you really don't want the calories, decorate your cake with a meringue. Okay, so we're gonna mix this on low and add in our butter a tablespoon at a time. I like to think of it as dropping coins into a wishing well, but it's butter and meringue. In you go. Just let the butter incorporate a bit before adding in the next piece. Alright, I'm going to show you what this looks like now, because this is like the panic stage. People are like, we'll see this, and even the meringue had more structure than this like halfway made buttercream. You might have cause to panic if you didn't know. It's all going to be okay. So just remember, it's all going to be okay. Alright, next stick. Let me show you what 3 sticks of butter looks like. Oh no, what is this nonsense? This is sad. This isn't buttercream, it's ruined. No, it's not ruined, it just needs that extra stick. So, even though this looks sad, it's looking exactly right. Don't panic. Right, back on you go. Okay, let's take a look now. Oh, this looks more buttercreamy. It has more structure. You can see there, it's stiffened up. Still not all the way together though. So we're going to let it run, but don't forget to scrape that bowl down because there is pure meringue at the bottom of it, and you don't want that. Okay. This is whipped up for a while, and if you notice any problems, like, oh, there's little clumps of butter in here, or it's still too soupy, John, even though I added in 4 sticks of butter, pop it into the fridge for a few minutes, take it out, or just keep whipping. You can't over whip this really, so if you just let that mixer keep running, it'll come out okay. So here, yes, oh my gosh, so good. I'm going to show you a close-up of this so you can take a look. Amazing creaminess here. It's so nice.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you that video there, because with that first one we did the pure foam icing, but I wanted to show you what it was if you take it another step farther along, where instead of it just being that meringue type of icing, the foam icing, that you take it a little step further and you add some butter to it, and then we have an Italian meringue buttercream. So this can develop from there. There is a cousin to this, a Swiss meringue buttercream as well, which just involves cooking the egg whites and the sugar together on a water bath before you add the butter. And so if we take a look at fudge icing, so how do we make that? So we sift powdered sugar into a mixing bowl, we add corn syrup and shortening and other liquids, we bring all of this up to the boil, and then we beat the hot liquid slowly, including into the powdered sugar, as you can see in the second picture right down here. And so when we're adding that hot ingredient into there, and we're beating that into there using a slow speed, otherwise you're going to lose half of that powdered sugar, and then we're adding any flavoring extracts to it. There may be some vanilla that you add to it, maybe some bourbon or anything like that, and then we can decorate the cake afterwards. So with a ganache icing, so this is when we're heating heavy cream and chocolate. So we're actually going to take the chocolate shavings, we add those into the hot cream, and when we're adding any other flavoring ingredients too, you may have some bourbon, you may have some vanilla, something along those lines, and then you're literally going to pour that ganache, you're going to have it cooling over an ice bath down to about 120 if you're pouring it directly onto the cake, where you can see this picture right down here, we're pouring it directly onto the cake. However, if you choose to freeze the cake, then you can have it where the ganache is still at about 130 before you pour it onto that frozen cake. Either way, what you're looking for this to do is to glaze over the top of that cake. It won't form a very thick layer, but it will have this wonderful glazed layer that will completely envelop that cake to give a wonderful sheen to it and a real richness from this ganache. This is a very, very rich kind of an icing. Or you can actually chill that ganache separately down completely, and you can actually scoop it out and use that as chocolate truffles, a small soft chocolate, if you will. So preparing some glaze. So this is when we're making glazed donuts, things like that. So sugar, milk, melted butter, and vanilla extract generally, unless you want to have another flavor in there. So you're stirring all of these ingredients together until everything dissolves together, and you just adjust that consistency to exactly where you want it to be so that it will coat whatever particular item that you're using. This you have to use immediately because it will start to solidify pretty quickly. So you need to make sure that as soon as, when you're ready to use it, you're making it at that time. You really can't make this too far in advance. If you do have some that you're making in a little way in advance, make sure you keep it covered. Otherwise it does tend to form a shell over the top. The royal icing. So this is where we're making things like when we made our gingerbread houses. So this is egg whites, lemon juice, and powdered sugar that we're putting together to get the right consistency we want. We want to be able to use this to put into a piping bag very often, so that we can pipe it out. So you want it to have almost like a toothpaste kind of a consistency to it. You're beating the icing up to make it good and smooth. You don't want to have any clumps of powdered sugar in there. And then you can add different flavorings, different colorings to it. Just make sure you keep this covered or in a piping bag until you're ready to use it. If you don't, then it's going to start forming that shell. It will solidify very quickly, which is great if you're building a gingerbread house, but it's terrible if it's sitting in a bowl going solid. You can't save it. Once it's gone solid, it's done. You'd have to prepare a fresh batch. Alright, so now let's move on to souffles. So souffles are a baked good which are very, very light and fluffy. The souffles can either be savory or sweet. We can go in either direction. The base of them is eggs, flour, and whichever particular kind of flavoring that you're looking to add to it. So with a savory souffle, they can be perfect to have for breakfast, as a small appetizer, or as a starch to go with a meal. Desserts tend to be sweeter flavors, and they can be all sorts of different flavor, from fruit to chocolate to mint, all sorts of different things. So souffles require special handling. You have to be very careful, and you have to prepare them right when you need them. So we take the egg whites and we will beat those, and we're going to be baking these souffles in an oven, because that is what's going to make them rise. Having the beaten eggs, it holds the albumin that's in the eggs, holds all of the air, and that's going to help our souffles rise. But they are not something which is stable, so they will crush down, and they'll break down very easily if they're not correctly done. So once they actually go into the oven itself, like I said, the air that's trapped into the albumin of the egg is what's going to make it rise. But if you open that oven door, the cold air that will rush in will actually make them sink down. The moisture evaporates from the actual souffle as they rise up, and so that kind of helps to set the structure of the egg that's holding them together. But again, if you don't serve them immediately, they'll collapse down, and they look like a shriveled former self. They don't look good once they've been allowed to collapse down. How do we make one? So we prepare our base, and so you can see right here we have our ramekin right here. This is a very traditional method to actually cook our souffle in. And we're going to coat our mold with butter and sugar if it's going to be a sweet one. One thing that I always like to do as I'm coating it with butter, I would use a pastry brush to brush on the butter, and I brush it in an upward motion. I'm always going upwards. I've found that it does help that souffle to rise when you butter the mold going upwards. And so what we have here, this is a little parchment chimney that we've placed in the center here. This actually adheres to the mold right at the bottom. We're going to coat all of that with butter and sugar if it's a sweet one. So we add the flavoring to the base of our souffle. The egg whites we're whipping up to a medium peak. As you can see right here, if you were to hold this and this upside down, the whisk upside down, the peaks wouldn't hold. They wouldn't stay up like a mountain. They would flip over, kind of like a Dr. Seuss story where you see the mountains kind of curling over. So we fill the molds up to the level where we want them to be, but we place them into an oven at 400 degrees, a fairly hot oven, and then they go into the oven with the door closed. We don't open it until we're ready to serve it. And then as soon as we are ready to serve these, that's when we're taking them out of the oven. This is not something you can take out of the oven, ponder over, wonder if the customer or the guests are ready to enjoy it. This is something that we have to make sure that they are ready when this comes out of the oven. Otherwise it will flop down and it will be a failure. So let's take a look at pies. So we have lots of different types of pastries that we can use in pies, lots of different methods that we can use when we're making pies. So let's start off with one that's really simple. So we've got the 3-2-1 dough. So that means 3 parts of flour, 2 parts of fat, and that fat can be different types of shortening, or it can be butter, and then 1 part water. This makes a really flaky and crisp crust, or a pâte brisée. Is the traditional French name for it. And it has a wonderful pastry flavor. Make sure when you make any of these types of pastries that we don't overwork the dough. What's inside the dough? Well, we have gluten that's in the flour. And that gluten, even if we're using a softer flour, then that will start to get tight and stretchy. And so that will actually cause our dough to be less flaky, and it will be tougher, and it will actually shrink a lot more in the oven as well. So we use cold fat when we're working with this, whether we're using butter or shortening. We're using a cold fat and liquid. And so the fat is, like I said, generally shortening, butter, or lard. And it can actually be a combination of these as well. And then the liquid is generally milk or water. So a proper crust should be nice and flaky, tender, and flavorful. A crust which has been messed up, which hasn't worked out the way we wanted it to be, is heavy and tough, and generally has shrunk in the oven as well. So when we're making that pie crust, we're cutting the solid fats into the flour. We want to actually break them up into the flour so that it actually creates these very small pieces of fat within the flour. So we're always handling that dough quickly. We're not overworking it, like I said, otherwise you can make it much tougher. We want the fat particles in between all the flour to melt as it's cooking, so that it will form a flaky pastry dough top and base, and it just makes tender layers that crumble apart. Overhandling makes a very tough crust. So when we look at pies that have a crumb crust, so very often this can be things like graham cracker crusts or nut crust or different cookie crusts. So these are really easy to make. This is when we're basically just taking some graham crackers, mixing those with some butter, some sugar, or some cinnamon. We're just crumbling those down, crunching those down and mixing them up, and we go and pack them into the base of our pies. This is a really simple one. These can be used to either make hot bases, we're baking things into them, or to make cold bases, where we're adding this directly into a chilled base. So to make pie dough, so we'll dissolve the salt into the water, make it so that it will disperse much easier. We're cutting the fat into the flour, and then we're adding that cold water to mix it all together. We're always chilling that dough as well. As you can see in here, you've got small little particles of the fat that we've broken down into there. Once it's prepared, we're going to wrap it with cling wrap so it doesn't get a skin on it, and we're going to put it into the refrigerator so it can chill. We're going to allow the gluten that's in that pastry to relax. Again, this will help us to get that nice light and flaky pastry. So we're turning the dough out onto a floured surface. And now something that's really important, mistakes that very often can be made, is where people will put too much flour down. As you can see, there's just a very light sprinkling of flour that's been placed out on here, and that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to have. We're rolling the dough out, and try and roll it nice and evenly. We don't want to have it where it's thicker on one side, thinner on the other. We want to roll it out nice and evenly. And then we're cutting the pie to fit into the pan. So it could be that you may be actually cutting out individual small pieces that you would add into a small little pan. Or in this case, we're making one large pie, so you actually roll it straight into here. Press it down at the edges, and then we can actually go around with a knife just to get a good sharp edge all the way around the outside of this pie. And then after that, we can actually place an entire layer right over the top, or we can create a lattice, as you can see on here, where we've actually woven the actual pieces one over on top of each other and under each other to create a wonderful woven lattice top. It gives a wonderful effect, and it shows off the pie filling that you have in there as well. And then we bake off until the pie crust is completely cooked through, a nice golden brown on top. So with blind baking, this is something which a lot of people forget to do, and they can have a pie base that can be very soggy because the pie filling itself just sat onto that raw dough, and when you place that in the oven, it can just steam that dough. So we want that pastry crust to be nice and light and crispy and crumbly, and then we can actually enjoy a really nice pie with all the filling in there being a separate entity. So what we do, we'll blind bake this base. So if we just have the pastry laid out into here, into the pie tin, and then we use a fork to prick holes all around. This allows any steam to evaporate, and this will allow this pie crust to get nice and crisp as we part bake it. And so what we do then, we add some parchment paper on top, because we don't want these beans to touch the actual pie crust. And then we're just going to pour either some raw beans, or you can actually purchase blind baking beans, which are basically a clay bean, clay spheres, that you just pour straight into the parchment paper right here. This just helps to kind of weight everything down and avoid any air bubbles from bubbling up and ruining the look of your pastry crust. These beans can then be reused again and again for blind baking. I wouldn't necessarily cook the beans to eat after that, though, because they will become very hard. So then this is perfect for if you want to do some custard fillings, or if you want to have a pudding filling, or fresh fruit filling. So it can be that you can cook that base all the way through, or you can just part cook it as well. And so if you want to have it as something where you want the base to be fully cooked through and you're adding something to it, you'll cook that base through a little more, or you can just part way cook it, take out those beans, and then you add in the filling. So say if you're adding in some apple pie filling, you would add that into the pre-cooked base. That pre-cooked base now isn't going to cook anywhere near as fast as the pie crust will that's going on top, because it's in direct contact with that fruit filling. And so you can then cook that base through with the topping over on the top as well, and once it comes out, it will have a wonderful flaky, crisp base, and all the wonderful flavors of the actual pie as well. And you can serve that hot or cold. We generally will serve pies with either whipped cream or meringue or ice cream. Ice cream would be known as a la mode. And you can add some wonderful toppings to it as well. Things like chocolate cream pie toppings to it, or if you're making a lemon meringue pie, you can actually pipe the meringue on top of the lemon filling, and you can just blowtorch the top of it to give that wonderful finished effect. So let's look at some laminated doughs. Laminated doughs take a lot longer to produce, but have a very, very different effect for the finishing of them. So laminated doughs is where we build up layer upon layer upon layer to create this dough. So this is used for things like Danish pastry, croissant, and puff pastry. It has a very flaky quality to it, and as long as it's been made really well, then it can actually create something which is very puffed up and large and looks gorgeous. It gets a wonderful golden brown color when it's fully cooked through. So it all involves making sure that we've got the proper mixing methods, rolling techniques as we're laminating over the dough to create the base layer, and then adding in butter and folding that through. We have to also make sure, as we're making it, that we allow time for it to rest. As we always talk about with all of our baked products, when we're making pastry, we want to give it time to rest so the gluten can relax in it, so that it doesn't then shrink as we're cooking it. It doesn't get tough and crunchy. We want it to be nice and light and flaky. So let's take a look. I've got a quick video that I can show you. We're going to use our beater paddle, and so this butter was right at room temperature. I just put it in the fridge for a few minutes just to slightly cool it, but for the most part it's pretty much about room temperature, so it's very pliable. That's what we need for it to be. Then I have all-purpose flour. Let's sprinkle that over the top. Raise this up and start it slow. It's like you'll be wearing it. I'll just cap this over with the cling wrap so that it's going to make this relatively even kind of shape. I'm going to put it in the fridge until it starts to set, so that way it won't just kind of squish out the melted butter from the front. Okay. With our Detron, we have all of our ingredients together, and we basically just add all of these ingredients in to the mixer, this time with the dough cook, because we are creating a dough to go around the outside of the barrage. So again, start it off slowly so that you don't make this big cloud of flour. So we can now turn this out. It should nice and cleanly just drop right out. And it's all come together as a full dough, right? If you have any dry parts in there, it's still got to go a little bit longer. Okay, but it should be a nice, moist, but not sticky dough. It comes away from the side of the pan. So let's place it in there. We actually want to form it into this square shape. This will help us. You'll see when we come to roll it, it will really help us be able to roll it into a rectangle that then will encapsulate the barrage. Wrap it over, and this will go in the refrigerator, ready for later on when it's having time. We have our barrage and our Detron dough. That is now has started to relax out. So as we start to roll it, it's not going to try and stretch back in as badly. Anytime you're working dough that has flour, it starts to develop the gluten again, and it wants to start tightening up. So that's why we have to be really careful to avoid that. So, good dusting. Because we've got so much butter in here, we want to have a good dusting because it can get sticky. We want to avoid sticky. So, flour across the top, flour your rolling pin. Go ahead and dust it off. So that way, these layers will adhere to each other. Alright, so I now have my first batch. Place it this way. So again, make sure it's not going to stick. So about that same size again that we did when we first added it in. So go ahead, roll over, dust off, so that it will adhere on these areas. Then right here as well. Okay. And bring this over. So now we're going to go ahead and let this rest again. I'm going to wrap this in cling wrap. It's going to go back in the refrigerator so that it can rest again. go ahead and take a knife, cut this right in half. You can just see all these laminations running through here. Just gives us all of the ability now. In between these layers, we're going to now have steam and fat, where it's trapping in those steam layers, so our puff pastry will just rise up as we bake it in the oven. We've got some great plans for this puff pastry. Okay, so let's look at some uses for this puff pastry. So that puff pastry is called pâte feuilletée. So feuilletée means squares or laminations or layers or leaves. And so this can be used for both sweet and savory applications. So as you can see over here, this is a beef Wellington. You have the actual fillet of beef, the entire tenderloin of beef, in fact, that's in here. And then around the outside you have, it's a mixture of onions and mushrooms, which actually are part of a duxelle. And then we have the puff pastry around the outside. This is a very technical but very classical dish. And the tricky part is to not overcook the beef right here, so that the puff pastry on the outside is just about cooked right when the beef is perfectly cooked to the right temperature. But then also on top of that, not allowing the base of our puff pastry down here to get soggy from the juices from the meat. It's a very difficult dish to be able to make. And then we have a sweet pastry that's right under here, a cinnamon pastry that's right underneath here. So when we make roll-in dough, so this is where we're combining all the ingredients together, blending them with a hook attachment. And so as you can see on here, this is our hook attachment, because this is an attachment that is actually going to knead our dough together. We shape the dough into a ball, and then we roll the dough into a rectangle, and then we're doing it till it's rolled to about a ½ inch thick, and then 3 times as long as it is wide, as you can actually see on here. So we're spreading that butter onto there and folding it 1/3 without butter, and then over to that center third. And so this is a way that's traditionally seen as creating our puff pastry. However, as you saw on that video, though, the way that she was actually working it, she was actually placing out the trompe, the actual butter part, as a separate part underneath, and adding the dough inside. So as we can see, it can work both ways. But either way, though, the most important part is we're making these folds, we're creating these laminations as we go. And you can actually see we've got all these leaves that are here. Then we're making sure that we're resting it by covering over a plastic wrap, putting it back in the refrigerator, allowing it to rest. And then when we bring it back out again, we can roll it again, and then we're folding it in thirds again to add to all of these leaves, to these layers, so we end up with this fantastic product that we can use afterwards. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at phyllo dough. So phyllo dough is a very, very thin, unleavened dough. It's literally as thin as a leaf. This is something that we use to make baklava. And then we have choux pastry, or pâte à choux. So this is where we're actually combining water, butter, flour, and eggs together. We make eclairs, cream puffs, and profiteroles with this. So let's see, when we're using our phyllo dough, we have to be very careful with it. It's extremely delicate. So we're going to use some warm clarified butter with it. We're going to thaw the phyllo pastry dough. It always comes in frozen if you purchase it in. We keep it under refrigeration, obviously, to keep it nice and safe. We're opening the box, and we're removing the plastic packaging. We're unrolling the sheets. They normally come in bundles rolled up. But then we're going to lay them out flat, and we're going to put a damp single-use paper towel over the top. As you can see, these are incredibly delicate sheets, and they will dry out very, very easily to where they're unworkable. So you really want to just remove one layer at a time, placing it onto the table. You brush that top sheet over with some butter, and then you start working in the center and work your way out to the edge. Depending on what type of thing you're going to make. You may be making spanakopita, which that's something that has cheese and spinach in, where you're actually placing a filling in there and rolling it over into triangle shapes. Or if you're making the baklava like this, you're actually you're creating leaves, you're creating layers within the baklava here. And so it's important that you, as you're removing each of the sheets, that you just take them out one at a time. You're keeping them buttered up, and you're working with them fairly quickly. You're brushing those layers with butter. As you're bringing out more and more layers, just so that way they don't dry out before you're ready to be able to place them into the oven for baking off. So when we're making pâte à choux or pastry that we use for making eclairs, it's also called Choux Pastry. So we're combining together the butter. We're bringing that up to the boil with the water, as you can see in this top picture here. And then once we bring that up to the boil, then we're adding the flour. We are then stirring it vigorously. We're allowing that to cool down, and then we're going to add that into our mixer, as you can see below. And now it's a ball of dough that we're working with at this stage. Now this is where we're adding one egg at a time to the mix, and then as it starts to get to the stage where the dough falls off the paddle, we have enough eggs in there. Always just be very aware that your egg size may cause a problem with the mixture here. Make sure that you pay a close attention to the recipe itself as to how much egg and what size of egg to use with this. Just to make sure that you don't overdo it, because you want to have exactly the right kind of consistency for your choux pastry to come out successfully. And then you pipe out the dough into whichever particular shape you want. And in this case, if you're making eclairs, we're piping them out into these bar shapes right here, so that as they cook, they'll actually puff up to significantly larger sizes than they are. And then they'll finish off, as you can see right here. These can be then filled with either cream, or you can create some other types of fillings that you can add in there. Then you can dip the top into a chocolate fondant to go and just finish them off at the end there as well. So I think we learned a lot about cakes and pies here. There's a lot of information that was held within all of this. Take a look again. If there's anything that you didn't take in the first time round, ask questions on anything. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I will see you in the next chapter. Cheers!